current ad
State University Nurses Associations.
Yes.
So you're
Good afternoon. My name is Larry Klock. I work for the University of Illinois Hospital in accounting. And I am a member of the UIC SUAA board and am proud of representing that organization. To that end, I wanted to introduce Dick Simpson, 51-year professor here, author of over 20 books, former alderman, and University of Illinois and State of Illinois treasurer. So we do appreciate him coming to talk about state of political affairs here this year. 2 years ago, he had a presentation after the 2016 election, and it was quite crowded at that time. Still, we were in shock then, and it's probably recognizing that the pendulum does swing a bit. We'll hear his views on what we might be able to expect in the next few years. Dick?
Thank you, Larry. So I think since we're a small group, I'll just stay here. If you can't quite see me, just move slightly, and hopefully you'll be able to. I'm happy to use the mic if we get a bigger crowd. So what I want to talk about was particularly, everybody hear me, or do you need me to use the mic? Okay. I want to talk about the meaning of the 2018 election and what is coming up in 2019. 2019 is particularly relevant because they're filing petitions starting Monday. They have 1 week in which to file petitions. I'll come back to that race separate. So first of all, what happened this last November 6th? Well, a blue wave did sweep, but it swept in different amounts in different parts of the country. It was particularly strong in Illinois, and it was fairly strong in the Midwest. Some other places it was not as strong and not as powerful. Nonetheless, when the dust settled, the things that were the same is the Republicans still control the White House. The Republicans still control the Senate. There's several recounts going, so we're not quite sure, but they have anywhere from 52 to 54 votes in the Senate, depending on some recounts. And of course, the Supreme Court has tilted more conservatively. It's not quite Republican Democratic, but conservative liberal in judicial philosophy. Nonetheless, the Democrats now control quite handily the House of Representatives, and there's still a series of those races to be counted. The Democrats are well past 225 members of the House of Representatives. 218 is what's needed to control the House of Representatives. They'll probably end up with, 230 or something like that in terms of numbers, but there's so many recounts going, it's hard to get an exact number. Nonetheless, no matter how any of the recounts turn out, the Democrats have a clear majority. They're going to elect the next Speaker of the House. They're going to control every committee, and those committee chairmanships are particularly important. And they're going, a number of those key committees are going to have Illinois Democrats in significant position. They're moving up from the opposition party or the minority in the House of Representatives to becoming the majority, and that means they control the flow of legislation. People have talked about the oversight that they'll be able to provide. They'll be able to have subpoena power. They'll be able to investigate things. And the most important is they'll be able to block legislation that President Trump or the conservative forces want. So they want to build a wall. Well, they might get a little more money to build a wall, but they're not going to get enough to build a whole wall across the 1,200 miles or whatever it is that the wall is supposed to go across. There will be, despite that blockage, there will be some areas of compromise. The most important one for Chicago and for Illinois is an infrastructure bill. The president has said he wants an infrastructure bill. We want that is, the people here in Chicago and Illinois want more money for roads, particularly downstate, but fixing the railroad system We are the hub of the railroads throughout the country, and we've got a bad bottleneck on the south side. To fix it, it's very expensive. The plans have been made. We've started on the project, but there hadn't been a cash flow. On questions like public transportation, getting new money either to extend the red line further out, get new cars, get better buses, and so forth, that's all in the issue of infrastructure, and it is presumed that we will get infrastructure legislation. It will have to be bipartisan. It has to pass the House, the Senate, and be signed by the President. But one of the challenges for Democrats now is it's not enough to win an election like this one in the House. They have to prove that they can be a positive force in government. And they can't just say, well, under the Obama administration we did X, Y, and Z. They have to say, if you elect more of us and the president in 2020, we would now do A, B, and C. And here's proof of it because we accomplished this, that, and the other, and we prevented the president from doing bad things. So I want to go back to just the election a minute. We can talk about what the effects of the election are together in just a minute. So as I said, the Democrats particularly made gains in the Midwest. If you were looking at geographically, where did the election have a lot of bite, although some of the southern states like Georgia and Florida and so on, Maryland and others, were important bellwethers of changes that are happening. But if you wanted to know the single biggest change in terms of impact, it was the Democrats won the suburbs. And Illinois is a very good example of this. There were 4 contested races among all the congressional races. People like Bill Foster and others got handily reelected, so there was no problem keeping any of the Democratic seats that had been won in previous elections. There were 4 contested seats. The Democrats won 2 of them. And the 2 of them they won were particularly important because they were in DuPage County and Kane County and some others, because these are districts that stretch quite a ways. But if you know, DuPage County was originally the most Republican county in the nation. If you go back to, say, the Nixon or Reagan eras, they produced more votes for Republicans than any other county. If you remember the most of you as retirees are old enough, you remember the 1960 election. The election in Illinois, there was a standoff. DuPage County was waiting to steal as many votes as they could, and Mayor Daley was waiting to steal as many votes as he could, and he was better at stealing votes than DuPage County was in that particular election. DuPage stole it for the Republicans, Daley stole it for the Democrats, and Daley stole more. It's there are other narratives. I mean, there are other good things about the 1960 election and Kennedy's idealism and all the things that happened afterwards. But in just where are the votes and what do they count for, it's important to see that shift because, first of all, it unbalances the Illinois congressional delegation. It is now heavily Democratic. It used to be that we were a state that was 50-50. The Republicans and the Democrats had more or less the same number of state legislators and the same number of congressmen and so forth. We were a bellwether state. We're not really a bellwether, or we're not in the sense of being a divided state. And how the state goes is reflective of the whole country. But we have tilted, and the tilt has all happened for practical purposes in the suburbs. The downstate, and not only in Illinois, but generally across the nation, the Republicans have a strong grip on rural areas of the country because there's a wonderful book on Wisconsin and Scott Walker. Scott Walker lost the election, as you know, but the book is called The Politics of Resentment. People in the rural area is mad as hell, and they have good reason to be, and the Democrats haven't managed to speak a message that appeals to the small town voter and the farmer and the rural voter, and that's the Republicans have really, with Trump particularly, have, it's not because all of them are bigoted, all of them are uneducated, or any of those kinds of reasons. It's because they are actually hurting and the country isn't responding, and the same at the state level in the case of Wisconsin. So the first big gain was the suburban gain and somewhat the Midwest, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. The other big gains were the youth vote went up exponentially, and the youth vote was 2/3 Democratic or more in some areas. I'll come back and talk about the UIC specifically in just a moment because we did an outstanding job, as we did in 2016. The second big trend, besides the youth vote, was the Latino vote, and generally the immigrant vote across immigrant groups. But the Latino group is particularly important. They're at least 12 or 13% of the population now. They're the growing part of the population. They're the young part of the population. A lot of Latinos are turning 18 and are able to register to vote. Latinos are very frightened about the immigration situation and are becoming citizens in large numbers. So I'm not quite sure why the Republicans decided they should alienate the youth and alienate the immigrants, because that's not a very wise strategy. You know, just talking pragmatically, not even quite talking ideologically. But that has, in general, been what went on, and it was confirmed in this election more than any previous election. I'll come back again to specifics, but I also want to say that all elections are local. As Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, famously said, all politics is local. So it wasn't enough to have issues that were national issues. Obviously, health care was central in the election. So were some other issues. In Illinois, I'm sure you could all repeat the ads that were run by J.B. Pritzker and run by Ronner. So there was this level of discourse going on, but you had to have a congressman, congressional candidate who somehow spoke to their district. Take Lauren Underwood, for instance, a surprising victory. By the way, that's the 14th congressional district, is the suburbs going northwest. She was a nurse. She was someone who had had problems with pre-existing conditions. First, nurses are much more highly valued than, say, politicians or congressmen or whatever, and just in terms of image. I mean, congressmen are, you know, about the bottom of the hierarchy in terms of prestige. It used to be significant and important, but that's somewhat changed in the American mind. Nurses are a good symbol, and so Lauren was able to speak to the health question, the question of Obamacare and saving pre-existing conditions and so forth, uniquely, personally, and effectively. And that made a huge difference in her win. If it had been a different candidate, it might have been a different outcome. But in addition, what wasn't looked at is King County had a revolution. They not only elected, among the several counties that were involved in that district, a new congressperson. They elected half of the county board. They elected people down ballot. I think they elected a sheriff. Talking about switch from an all Republican county to a competitive Democratic county in one election. And it was partly mobilized, particularly by women, after the Trump victory, that changed that suburban landscape that significantly, and we can see it in Illinois. So beyond the caravan and beyond the issues that were national issues, you had to have candidates that were viable locally, speaking to local concerns in a way that was effective. Some other things about the 2018 election which tells us something of its meaning. It was the most expensive midterm election in the country's history. We saw it here in Illinois. J.B. Pritzker spent $170 million of his own money. It turns out that J.B. Pritzker paid $72.90 per vote. So you might think of other things you would do with $80 or so than buy a vote, but that's how much the Pritzker campaign spent. And of course, Ronner didn't spend quite as much and lost the election, but he spent a lot. He's put in $70 million of his dollars. So if you're thinking of running for governor, I think you might, ask your spouse, can we contribute $170 million? Can we contribute $70 million? The price for running for governor before was $20 million. And it has gone up to, I mean, it wouldn't have to be at this level, but we're clearly talking $40 or $50 million to run for governor anymore in the state, in the state of Illinois. The congressional fundraising was also very high. So if I mentioned there were 4 competitive districts in Illinois, the Democratic Party candidates in those districts raised $4 million each. Now, you didn't have to have the most money. For instance, Peter Roscom had $7.5 million. Sean Casten, the Democrat who won, had $5.5 million. But you had to get to that threshold so your message could get out to the voters, whether on TV, direct mail, ground contact, door to door, and so forth. I've already mentioned that turnout was greater in this midterm election. We shouldn't be too proud of that because only 49% of the Americans voted. They were registered. Only half showed up to the polls. But that's better than the 37% who showed up in 2014. The millennials, interestingly, for the first time, were the largest voting group in Chicago. Always before, it's been our group, the 65 and older, who were the big voters. The millennials are taking that role because they're turning out and voting. So we've been on campus for a long time, and you know, in the old days, getting student vote out was very difficult. There are a few other general things. I'll talk about the state elections, and I'll come back specifically to the student vote or the youth vote. So one of the things that happened is 1992 was originally called the Year of the Woman. More women candidates were going to get elected. We finally got to 10% of the Congress were women. Well, this year we blew past that. There are 102 plus. I think it's probably now 104. The recounts are going on, and a number of women candidates are winning in the recounts. In the House, in the U.S. House of Representatives, I think the number is 12 or 14. I think it's 14 in the Senate. This means that we went from the 10% in 1992, the Year of the Woman, to nearly 25% now. This has been the Year of the Woman in terms of making significant moves forward in terms of women being equally electable as men to high offices. And that, you know, some people did, well, Hillary didn't win president last time. We've now got an A team or B team, or however you want to think of it. We've got a second tier of people who are going to be qualified to run for offices like president or vice president or so forth. And that's a significant change that happened in this election. In the state elections, the state elections were referendums on the incumbents. Both Donald Trump as president, but like here in Illinois, Bruce Rauner. The real debate in the election was between Pritzker might bring in corruption and be a tool of Mike Madigan from the Rauner point of view. The answer from Pritzker, which won in the argument, was Rauner hasn't run the state. Can't even run the state. We don't want him to continue being governor. You know, here at this university, we'd like to have a budget occasionally so we could actually have state funds for the MAP scholarships for students and so forth. Rauner couldn't produce even that, which is a basic minimum for Republican or Democrat. And that kind of thing was happening in every state. That is, the arguments were different state by state, but it was a referendum on whichever party was in power. The Democrats lost some high-profile governor races, like in Iowa and Ohio. It looks like they've lost Florida, and they may lose Georgia. But they won in 7 states that they didn't have before. In Illinois, Kansas, Maine, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, and Wisconsin. What that means in broad sweeping terms is the gap diminishes. We had like 2/3 of the states were controlled by Republicans before. It's now like 25, 23, depending on these final recounts. So the Democrats have almost reached parity in governorships. They also won 7 legislatures in the country. So that it's going to be a much more equal. And the reason that's so important is 2020 is when we do the redistricting in the country. for both Congress and the state legislature. And the last time around, the Republicans control the redistrict, not here in Illinois, but in most states. This time, it will be much more equal. That doesn't mean it will be fair and just and so forth. It simply means that it's not going to be quite so overwhelmingly Republican or conservative. There are some veto-proof or supermajorities in both the General Assembly and in the Senate here in Illinois. So the Democrats are totally in charge of our government in Illinois, and whatever happens, they get either the praise or the blame. So there's no excuse for the Democrats not, performing and producing something worthwhile, like state budgets, funding for universities, funding for education, solving some part of the pension problem, and so forth. One thing that is important in Illinois, half of the state legislative races had only one candidate on the ballot. That is, it was either a Democrat running unopposed or a Republican running unopposed because of the gerrymandering. Obviously, that's unacceptable in a democracy. So we look like a banana republic or something here in Illinois when you look closely at what's going on. 4 states did, by referendum, impose neutral or impartial redistricting commissions and took it away from state legislators and governors. We, of course, did not. First of all, we couldn't do it by that method. The attempt to do that was thrown off 2 years ago off the ballot by court decision. Okay, let me talk about the youth vote, because that's particularly important and all of you care about it because you've been educators and worked at the university for a long time. So nationally, the youth vote went from 19% in 2014 to 31% in 2018. Here at UIC, we registered more than 4,000 new student voters, and we had also a 19% vote in 2014. We don't have the count yet, but I can tell you we voted 1,300 students in early voting and in our polling place here on campus. In the last election, 2016, we had the highest increase in student voting in the country. We went from, in a presidential year, from 42% to 55% voting. Now, there's always the chance to do more, but UIC is on a major path forward in what's called civic engagement, not only in voting, but in all kinds of things. And that's any way that any of you can have influence on departments or programs or agencies to make civic education and civic engagement broader at all forms, working with neighborhood organizations and so forth. That's to be done, but we really can congratulate ourselves on what we've done. I've been here 51 years, as it was said, and this is the highest level of voting in an off-year election in our history, I think. I don't quite remember in this, in the 60s, we had a lot of turmoil. Voting wasn't something we were paying a lot of attention to. We had pretty high turnout in, say, the 68 election and so forth. But I still think this is the highest we've done in both registration and voting. More people able to participate and more people participating by a lot. Some other losses for the Republicans. On the Cook County Board, there are now only 2 Republicans out of 17 members. That they lost 2 seats. In DuPage County and Kane County, they went from like 1 member on a Democratic member on their county boards, they're roughly the same size as ours, to about half and half. So there's an enormous sea change, not only at the congressional level. Now let me talk just a minute about the 2019 election. I always like to think that, well, we've had this precursor, sort of the scrimmage, and now we're ready for the real show. Let's get to the main game. What matters in Chicago is mayor and alderman, not those congressmen or state legislators or people in other states. That's sort of the Chicago view of life. The mayoral petitions are being filed this Monday. They go in for a week. They have from the 19th to the 26th. They're essentially 100 days until the election February 26th, runoff election April 2nd. There are, at any given moment, 18 or 19 candidates say they're running for mayor, but when we're all is said and done, I think there will be about 8. There are 1 or 2 that's a little hard to tell. I guess Willie Wilson will get on the ballot. I don't know why, but I think he probably has the petition signatures, maybe. Did last time. But the candidates who will be on the ballot are Tony Preckwinkle, Lori Lightfoot, Susanna Mendoza, Bill Daley, Paul Vallis, Gary McCarthy, Gary Chico, and maybe Anya Amira, although she failed to do so last time in 2015. So even with Chance the Rapper and so forth, she's got a lot of publicity, she's got a little bit of money. She's a great candidate in terms of she was here, if you were at our National Student Issues Convention with the other 7 candidates. Very articulate, some new ideas like having a Chicago public bank, and there's all sorts of reasons why that might be a good idea. But it's not clear whether she'll make the ballot given her past performance. It's how broad is this? So why is it so hard to get on the ballot if you're running for mayor? Well, you have to have 12,500 legal or legitimate signatures. To do that, you have to really gather at least 25,000 signatures. So if you read in the newspapers next week that such and such candidate filed 15,000 petition signatures, they're a former candidate. They'll be knocked off. If you want, I can go through all the reasons, but it's things like if you just collect them down in the loop or here at UIC, you'll get people from Skokie signing and you know, Schaumburg and wherever. You'll get people who moved their address but haven't changed their registration. Those are all illegal. Moreover, if you sign petitions, you'd like, you know, 4 people have asked you to sign for mayor. You sign 4 petitions, those are invalid. You get 1 signature. So whoever's notarized signature is filed first is the signature that counts. Now, to challenge someone, you've got to have a whole team of people because you're looking at a computer screen that has the signature and the actual signature and so forth. But I've been through this. Let me just say it's not an easy task. And so if you come in with a minimum number of signatures, you're off the ballot. For alderman, it's not so difficult. There'll be 250 candidates plus for alderman, 50 wards. There you have to have only roughly 500 signatures. Depends on how many voters voted last time. So it can range from about 450 to 500. I think there may only be 1 ward that requires more than 500 signatures. So that's a doable task, but they still screw up with an enormous frequency. So about 50 or 60 of those candidates that file will be tossed off for alderman, and we'll be left with whichever the slate is. One way of keeping track of the alderman is that the Progressive Caucus, which is the caucus that most opposes Rahm Emanuel, stands for, you know, think Bernie Sanders, think reform. They vary, you know, how much they're to the left and not, because it's local issues, and as they say, there's no Democratic or Republican way to pay off the road. But the Progressive Caucus is now about 11. The Progressive Caucus itself is endorsing 10 candidates for alderman. They're hoping to grow themselves by 10. They probably won't succeed, but they certainly grow themselves. Last time, all of the progressive aldermen who ran for re-election were re-elected. So you can expect the progressive bloc to get bigger. How much bigger, we'll have to see. In addition to the petition signatures, the money, to run for mayor, it costs $5 million. To run for alderman, $250,000, $250,000. So again, if you see Smith got on the ballot but has only raised $10,000, say goodbye to Smith. They don't have a chance because getting the message out costs money. You've got to have 3 paid staff, a campaign headquarters, I'm talking about aldermanic level, 3 paid staff, and a campaign headquarters. You have to be able to send direct mail. If you're going to send direct mail, you have to send between 3 and 9 pieces of mail for it to work. You have to print brochures, buttons. You hopefully can take a little bit of cable television and radio advertising. If there's a community newspaper, some ads in the community newspaper. It all adds up fairly quickly to being expensive to even run for alderman in a single ward. You have to have sophisticated social media and voter analytics. To buy that package, that's voter analytics, is several $1,000s just for the software, as you might think of it. So what else do we know about it? Well, we know, I think the election this time will, particularly for mayor, I'll just take that one, because aldermanic can be over, you know, lots of things that are rather local. But for mayor, I think the dividing line is going to be between the status quo and higher taxes or machine politics, you know, some phrase about Rahm Emanuel or the old machine or something like that, versus true reformers like, say, the Harold Washington administration. You know, whether it's labeled progressive, reform, can't tell you how each candidate's going to work with that. Now, obviously, someone like Bill Daley is not going to phrase it that way. So the opposite, we can see, for instance, in campaigns like Gary Chico's, I'm the most experienced person who can run the city because I've done A, B, and C, and so you should elect me, forget all this machine and reform and whatever, just elect me because I'm competent and I'll solve all these terrible problems of the city. So there'll be a fight to define what's the election about. It will be the first fight at the level of ideology or newspapers or media or however you want to think about it. There are a bunch of challenges to the city, and I teach a whole course about that. I'll be glad to talk about the specifics, but that's the general framing, I think, that the campaigns will attempt to make a distinction between themselves on that level. I think there'll be more than 50% of the people vote in the February election. I have to tell you, though, that in 2015, in the runoff election between Chuy Garcia and Rahm Emanuel, which would seem like a pretty clear-cut, you know, kind of difference, no matter which side you liked, only 35% of the voters showed up. Now, Rahm Emanuel won 54% of 35% of the vote, so with 18% of the people or something like that, Rahm Emanuel was reelected. Now, the February election, there were slightly more because of both the aldermanic and the mayoral races. I think that's probably overload for most of you. I'm happy to unpack it and talk about what these trends mean and what both, you know, particularly for the 2018 election, but also to, you know, forecast what's happening in 2019. And also glad for your comments, you know, about what you're thinking about what the election meant and what the new election might mean. Do participate if you're a Chicagoan. Well, even if you're not, there are a number of suburbs that also have elections that are municipal elections in February.
Do you think that there's any prospect of getting Citizens United reversed and just generally moving in the opposite direction, getting big money out of politics?
I think the most hopeful of the way to, I don't think the courts are going to change Citizens United. The Supreme Court doesn't look to me to be any more friendly to changing their view about this. But I do think public financing is still the way to go. As I mentioned, it isn't always having the most money, it's having enough money. And if we can make that, the way take the way New York City works and Minnesota, Maine, and other states that have it, but New York City is the closest to Chicago. Essentially, if you give me $100, let's say, or any other amount that's below $250, the city or state will match that with 6 times the amount, or 7 times, depending on whose model you follow. There's some different formulas. So that means you're really giving me $800. Well, if I get a number of people to do that, I can raise enough money to get my message out in a way that's difficult if I have only your $100 or your $10 or whatever the multiplier is the same with each of them. So that would, and people say, well, you know, I don't like to spend our tax money on elections. You don't believe in democracy? What's wrong with you? It's worth it because we want choices that are presented to the voters that are meaningful choices. And if we allow only the wealthy billionaires or the people that big business or even big labor or somebody likes and can plunk down millions of dollars into the campaign, they also bought that candidate for practical purposes. And your $100 contribution, I don't care about as long as I'm getting, you know, $50 million or $50,000 or some other money from major contributors. Your $100 doesn't influence me very much. So we want to make whoever's elected, whichever side, more accountable to the public. And public funding, under the laws we have currently and the court decisions we have currently, I'm absolutely convinced that public funding is the only way to restore democracy. There are other arguments you could, try and do X, Y, and Z, but reversing Citizen United by another case before the Supreme Court doesn't seem to me to be one of the viable alternatives. I'm not an attorney. You could consult with law professors or something, but I don't think it's going to work. It's a bad decision. It's a terrible decision on many levels, and it's because the justices didn't really care about what reality was. As a social scientist or political scientist, we like to have some empirical evidence for what would be the effect of doing A, B, or C, and that was well known before Citizens United and was totally ignored. By the way, just one other aside, there is a new group called I'm not sure I'll get it right even though I'm a member, Social Science Scholars Network is roughly the name, and it's people like sociologists and political scientists and others who there are 80 of us who have banded together to say we will provide any mayoral campaign, or aldermanic, but particularly the mayoral, with empirical based information, how to deal with pensions or how to deal with racism or segregation, affordable housing, whichever way you want to phrase all that, or education. And we have begun meeting with the first several mayoral campaigns to offer the services. If any of you would like to be part of that network, and you do have expertise, you could provide expert opinion to mayoral campaigns. If you give me that information afterwards, I will send it to the coordinators. Barbara Ransby is one, Barbara Rissman is one of the coordinators here on campus. There are several of us from UIC, but they're also from Northwestern Loyola and so on. And I think that's a positive development. I don't know that it'll elevate the debate, but it might if they had to occasionally refer to facts in making claims. But there were questions or comments over here. Yes?
Now that the Democrats are sort of in control of the state, what do you feel is that they'll have to do in order to actually move Illinois forward and continue to be in favor with the electorate? And do you think that's going to happen?
So I think there are several things that they have to do. The first is sort of simple. Was the test that Ron failed. That they have to have a regular budget. So at the university we ought to know we're going to get $450 million for the U of I system or whatever the dollar amount is, and that we're going to get MAP grants are not going to be on and off the table, and they will be increased by some reasonable amount so more students can go to college. But just having a budget, a workable budget that can be depended upon, helps business, it helps universities, it helps schools, it helps everybody. Second thing is they need more funding because, and I'm not going to get these numbers right, they change a little, but we're about $8 billion out of budget at the moment. That is, we have unpaid bills. I think actually the unpaid bills go to $12 billion. So we got to pay off what we've already spent that we didn't have the money for. The good news is some of the economic development that's going on in Illinois has increased the revenue, and that's helpful. We need more economic development because that's the cheap way to fund state government, is let somebody new open a McDonald's or whatever and give us some tax money. The other thing, though, they're going to have to do is the idea of essentially a graduated income tax is right. We need higher taxes for the more wealthy and lower taxes for the not so wealthy. And there are ways to do that besides passing the constitutional amendment. Since that was one of Pritzker's main campaign promises, although it was vague, which rates and who. I think the Democrats, if they didn't do anything at all with the tax system and we were still $8 or $9 billion every year out of whack, that would not be good. I think we have to make a sincere effort at a real plan related to the pensions, because for the state, I can't keep up with it, but it's about $112 billion owed to the pension fund to be able to be sure that all of us got our pensions when we retired. Maybe not next year, but 5 years from now, will there still be money in the pension fund? The answer is yes, but it's way out of whack. And you can't solve it in 1 year, so let's have a plan to solve it over the next X number of years, whatever number. And through IGPA and other groups here at the university system, we've told the state how to solve it. This isn't rocket science, it's just simple math, essentially. Not easy. I mean, it's going to cost some. So if they can't have a budget, they can't fund the budget in reasonable amounts with a new set of taxes that aren't onerous, and they can't make a dent in the pension problems, the Democrats are going to have a hard time coming back in 2020 and say, give us, your vote again.
You think they'll do it? I mean, do you?
I can't see why they shouldn't. Now, there'll be arguments about did they do it well enough, but, having a budget, every other government has a budget. We even have a budget this year. So it's not that tricky. I mean, I'm just setting minimum standard. I'm not talking about great leaps forward. The other thing we do need is more economic development. I don't mean giveaways to Amazon. I mean, regular, increasing, substantial development within the state. And because we have lagged behind most places in recovery since the Great Recession, and there's no reason we should be lagging behind even the other Midwest states in recovery. So those are just workmanlike solutions of running the government. I think there's no reason we shouldn't be able to make progress on those. Now, can we solve everything and be wonderful? That's a different issue. But just, running the ship properly and making progress on solving our problems is, to me, a doable task. And I say that as someone who's been in government. I mean, I know how to read a government budget and those kinds of things. Yes?
A couple questions about the mayoral and local elections for 2019. I forget, who do you think will emerge as the major mayoral candidates? Who do you hope will emerge as the major candidates? And who funds these campaigns?
Sure.
Whose interest is at stake in them?
Okay. So I gave you the list of who I thought the 8 or so candidates will be on the ballot. So that gets rid of, 9 of them at least. In terms of it's interesting, 3 of them are African American, 2 of them are Latino, and 3 are white. So you've got a split in each of the communities. So you have to be able to get a base in your own racial or ethnic group, but you're going to be split. So you have to have what's usually called a rainbow coalition. You have to have support across racial, ethnic, geographical communities in Chicago if you're going to be mayor. In the past, you usually only had to have 2 out of 3. If you take black, white, and Latino, which are roughly equal-sized groups, Latinos just now beginning to vote at the level of the others. The way it worked under Richard M. Daley, he had the support of the white and Latino community. This last time, Rahm Emanuel had the support of the white and a slight majority in the black community. So you have to get at least 2 out of 3 with some votes in the others. Harold Washington had heavy support in the black community, but significant support in the Latino community and progressive white support. So that's the kind of coalition that has to be put together. In terms of who, I think the white candidates, Daley, Vallis, and McCarthy, are likely to split the vote so much that that none of them may make it into the runoff. We'll see as they, first did they all get on the ballot and so forth. The other candidates, I don't think Anaya can get enough support. So I think she dropped, whether she gets on the ballot or not. So I think it's Preckwinkle, Lightfoot, Mendoza, and maybe Chico. But it's, you know, that are fighting for the two places. There's no doubt there's going to be a runoff. Now, your other question of how are they getting funded? Some candidates are almost self-funding, something we've gotten used to. Bill Daley just gave his own campaign $500,000. Willie Wilson gave his campaign all the money that's in his campaign. So there's some self-funding candidates in this group. I don't think they're going to be in the final two. The ones that are successful are the ones that are able to raise money from a series of contributors. I know more about the Lightfoot campaign than I do the others in terms of who's actually contributors, and it's a very large group. She's got petition signatures from all 50 wards. She's got money from across a broad spectrum, from larger contributors to very small contributors. And that's the model. Whichever one, Preckwinkle can do that, Mendoza can do that. You know, they all have to do it, but those kinds of candidates do have the capacity to do it. And that's going to be the winning formula for who gets into the runoff. And then really hard to predict the outcome of the election until we know who's in the runoff, because any of them could shoot themselves in the foot. You know, right this week we've got the fight between Preckwinkle and Mendoza. You know, is Mendoza really, you know, a front for to be Rahm Emanuel's second term? And then is Preckwinkle a true reform? You know, this argument's going to go back and forth among whoever's seen as leading candidates at any given point. And we only have, like I say, 100 days. So, and we've got Christmas and Thanksgiving and New Year's in between. Will interrupt the politics for, you know, half a week at a time. So it's going to get very intense once January gets here. You know, then you'll begin to. So the first test is that they get on the ballot. The second test is, have they raised $1 million now? And they have to have started trying to do that a while back. That will get you to knowing who the frontier are, more or less, round numbers. And then we'll see where it goes from there. Some of the candidates even that might get on the ballot may not, probably if they get on the ballot, I mean, there's no reason really to withdraw if you can get on the ballot. But who will they endorse? In other words, if a Paul Vallis doesn't make it to the runoff, who's he going to endorse? And not only him, which may or may not make any difference, but who will the people who are supporting him endorse? So one of the big fights at the moment is over the Rahm Emanuel contributors. You know, where will they go? He was able to raise $30 million. You'd like to have a Rahm Emanuel's contributors on your side because it makes life easy. They'll probably be split up a little. Yes?
I saw a proposal, it was just I guess some research. I think it was in the New York Times last Sunday about increasing the size of the House of Representatives. And it was to bring it up from like 435
yes.
to 500 some odd or whatever. And they came up with a formula saying it's the cube root of the population. They're saying that the 435 was set back in 1920. And of course, the U.S. population has grown, you know, 50% or more, probably 100%.
Right. So the problem at the moment is a congressman represents a little more than 750,000 people, 770 or whatever the exact number is. And that is a whole huge amount. I mean, as alderman, I represented 60,000 souls, and that was a fair task. And when I was running for Congress back in the 1990s, I had 550. I was appealing to 550,000, the population of 550,000 in the district. 750,000 is high. I've not seen any appetite or much debate about doing this. So, given that the Congress can barely agree that the sun came up today, I don't see this happening between now and 2020. You know, we get a new president, a new Congress, you know, we start talking about how to make democracy actually work, which is the topic of my next book. Then, you know, we might look at a whole variety of new arrangements that would allow us to have a democracy in the 21st century. My own sense is that there has to be more participatory democracy, whether it's 500,000 people that a congressman represents or 750,000, with no real contact with their constituents other than the phone calls coming in about immigration and Social Security, that I want to become a citizen, I want to get my Social Security check, which is 90% of the calls that a congressional office gets. I don't see, you know, when Peter Roskam can simply say, I'm not going to have town hall meetings even, give a side that the town hall meeting could somehow hold him accountable and force his vote a certain way. I think we've strayed pretty far if you look at the New England town meeting or something like that at the other extreme. So I want to see us redesign a whole bunch of things. I don't think we can keep democracy without public funding. I don't think we can have a meaningful democracy without some means of meaningful citizen participation on policy questions, not just the election every 4 years. That's my own view, and then I have specific views about how do you achieve that. But we can't have that discussion for the moment. We're just trying to keep Trump from doing something really crazy, you know, bombing somebody that he doesn't like, Iran or somebody, you know, keeping the trade wars such that we can actually have the economy work here in the United States and so on. Doesn't mean occasionally the Trump administration doesn't manage to do something well, you know, that helps. They do. But the best news of the election, in my view, is that at least we have a Democratic House of Representatives that can say, yes, that's a reasonable idea, let's have infrastructure. Or, no, that's a terrible idea, let's stop this trade war nonsense. Or, you know, at least moderate it in a way that it's workable to have the arguments about China and they're stealing intellectual property and so forth. That's perfectly true, but we need some check and balance, and now the Congress gives us for the first time the possibility of that. Because if the Democrats agree that Trump has proposed good policy A, great. If the Democrats come up with good policy A and Trump agrees to pass it, like infrastructure, terrific. Probably with that check and balance, anything they can possibly agree on has got to be a good thing. Yeah, here and then here.
When you talk about public funding for candidates, how would that work? Is that where, when I fill out my taxes and it says, do you want to give a dollar?
That's one way, no, but it's, the way it works is, so first of all, the candidate has to actually be on the ballot. So the petitions or whatever gets them there. But then, use his example, if he gives $100 and I'm a legitimate candidate, the government gives me a check for whatever the ratio is, $600 or $700, which means his $100 has, I still have to get citizens to give me money, but they can give it a reasonable rate, like $50 or $100, and it makes an actual difference in my ability to get my message out to you that I'm running and I stand for, you know, motherhood and apple pie or whatever it is I stand for. So that's how it works, and it's.
Is that already in place?
Oh yeah, Maine's had it for quite a while. New York City's had it for a decade. Los Angeles has it. Minnesota has it. I can't tell you all the places because I haven't kept up recently. But this is a decade-old idea that's been tested and works where it is used. And if it can be done in New York, we can do it. I mean, it's my general simple way of putting it. There are other considerations. Yes?
Is direct mail really still relevant? If so, for how long? Neither my students nor my daughters pay any attention to anything that comes through U.S. postal mail, and they vote, and they are going to be an increasing percentage.
So, first of all, the most, if I want to convince you to vote for me, the easiest way is for me or my precinct worker to come and talk to you face to face. That's the most likely way to get your vote. I mean, you may already be, you know, a reactionary Republican and never vote for me, or a progressive Democrat, they would never vote for, you know, so there's some barriers, but if I want to try and get you to vote for me and get you to the polls, an actual precinct worker or myself meeting with you is the most important. The second method that's broadest is direct mail phone. So you still have the problem with cell phones and cell phone numbers and all there are problems with that you're quite right, and it's declining in some extent, but that's the second most effective method. Third is social media. Well, I should take it back. I'm leaving aside the expensive things like TV advertising and so forth at the moment, but of the things that are sort of direct voter contact. So yes, direct mail followed by a phone call is effective. And to do direct mail is not one piece of mail, it's probably 9 pieces, but it has to be more than 3. So it's not just sending a postcard saying vote for me. And I can even tell you how you do it. You start with a positive message. Here's a picture with me and my family. Don't you like us? We live in your neighborhood. See me being nice to old people and young children and so forth. You get past that stage, I can attack my opponent. He's a scumbag. You shouldn't vote for scumbag A because of, he's, a serial killer or whatever. And then the Tribune endorsed me, or the Sun-Times, or somebody endorsed me that you care about. So you should really vote for me. See, I told you I was a nice guy back at the first, and forget I said that about the scumbag. Don't forget it, but don't blame me for it. So that's the way the direct mail campaign, it's not a single piece of direct mail. But the social media, so we have several advantages. We have what are called voter analytics. What voter analytics does is I can tell whether you voted in the last 3 elections, which party you voted for, and I can compare that to your credit card information and see whether you're driving a Rolls Royce and buying at Nordstrom's, or whether you go to Kmart. And that tells me something about how I should make my pitch to you. And then I start by building a web page, because I want to drive the media, the money, and the voter to my web page so I can get them as part of the campaign as much as possible. But I build off the web page, the Facebook page, the Twitter, Instagram, and whatever the new technique is by next week to reach the age group and the group I want. So you're really running multiple media campaigns, between the old brochure button and precinct worker to the direct mail people to the social media. And the social media is, again, not a one-shot, I have a Facebook page and I put up one photograph, I'm running for Congress. That isn't going to do it. It's like Trump, I have to be feeding that page, whichever one of the several social media, every day in the campaign. I was here in Peoria and I did such and such. I waved an American flag. I introduced a piece of legislation in Springfield, whatever. So it's a big operation, and there has to be a separate social media campaign. I mean, tell you what, the mayoral candidates at the moment, if you're around any of them, you'll see a camera following them. That's not NBC News. That's their own camera, because they're going to be making videos to go on their social media. So that's the short. If you really want to know, get my book, Winning Elections in the 21st Century, that's in the bookstore, because it breaks down how all of this is done in a modern 21st century campaign. Let's start here and go there, and then we may be winding down.
Maine had an election where it's like sorting or identifying preference. I guess they just had a representative that was elected because he didn't come in first, but if you added his second and his first together, it was higher than anyone else.
Right. There is a cumulative voting technique. In other countries it would be called also proportional representation. So you can do it in multiple ways. You can have multiple candidates in the same district running, or you can have just one seat. It's still a single district, but you ask for the first, second, and third choice of the voter. The voter sometimes will just put in their first choice and not second and third, but if they did do the other votes get all added in a formula, and the formulas differ slightly. But what it does it is an intensity vote. If I really care for you, it counts more than if I care for the three of you at the table about equally. I don't really care, as long as one of you gets elected. It's mathematical. It's done in many places. Is it a better system? Well, yes, in general. Are we going to adopt it in Chicago? No, don't rush out to buy stock in it. We're not